Welcome, everyone. We are live for Bible study.
Okay, let me call up the title screen. Can you see that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so again, today we're going to continue with a discussion of the Jewish exile, a study called By the Waters of Babylon in 4 parts, and this is part number 2. Let's just continue here. I always have trouble finding the stop share button. Okay, there we go. Last time we were in the middle of discussion about slavery, and I just want to recap a couple things from that. There is very little evidence that the Jews in Babylon were actually slaves. It may say so in some of the documents, but they really were not. Most of them were what you would consider the middle or upper class. And so it was unlikely that they would be made slaves in Babylonia. Slavery, again, for what it as it existed in Babylonia, was very, very different from what we have witnessed in North and South America in the last 400 or 500 years. It was a temporary thing in most cases. Slaves were often able to buy their freedom. Really, what it boiled down to was that there were 2 differences between a slave and a free person. I say free person because I will talk a moment about the status of women. Slaves had no vote, and there was still a lot of voting going on in local assemblies. Of course, once you got to the national level or the empire level, that was pretty much a male hierarchy that ran things. And there were very little voting at that point. There was also difference in slaves' status in terms of legal matters. So there was a difference between a free person suing another free person, a free person suing a slave, or a slave suing a slave. And all of these laws are written out in great precision and excruciating detail. And we have all of that in the various documents that we have. I mentioned women seem to have a greater status the farther down the structure you went. They seem to have as many rights and duties and powers in the small communities and the cities. But once you get up to the empire level, or the national level, they have very little power. And that, of course, would have been true in America up until fairly recently. One thing we note in going through all of this voluminous documentation we probably know more about certain days in Babylonia than we do about England of 50 years ago, because they just kept records of everything. But one of the things we notice in going through all this documentation is there's very little mention of jails or prisons. Except for prisons for prisoners of war are an exception to that. But it seems like they had very few facilities for confining people because of crime. One reason for that was there were a lot of capital crimes. If you murdered somebody, you died. If you committed adultery, at least the male usually died, and sometimes the woman as well. If you were involved in rape, convicted of rape, you died. Treason, of course, obviously meant death. But even robbery. Now here, let's make a distinction between theft and robbery. Theft is if you go into your neighbor's pen and steal a sheep in the middle of the night. That's theft. And the penalty for that, if you're found guilty, is you have to give 3 times back what you took. Robbery, on the other hand, would be that you used force and violence against your neighbor and took the sheep that way. And the penalty for that was death. So you didn't have a lot of you didn't have anybody guilty of a capital crime spending any time in prison because they were all dead. Now, other crimes, such as violation of property and some marital issues and things like that, resulted in restitution rather than in incarceration. So again, it seems like there were very, very few jails or prisons in the entire Mesopotamian area.
Richard, if I could just have one question, and that is do you think that because there were few jails or the incapacity to jail people, that's why all these other crimes were capital?
Well, I think, yeah.
Turning it around, because a lot of societies until fairly recently didn't have a lot of jails, and
right.
Punishments were more likely to be capital.
Yeah. And, I think that it sort of works both ways. It's kind of circular. I mean, if you can save the expense of building a jail, then you have more capital crimes. If you have more capital crimes, you have no need for those facilities. By the way, the first public building constructed in the city of Chicago was a jail. There's also a wonderful story that Martin and Marty used to tell about do you know Schaumburg, Illinois?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was a German settlement, almost entirely German speaking, and they built the jail. And somebody said, why would you do that? Because you have no crime in their town at all. And the answer was, for the outsiders. Anyway, that's a Schaumburg story, an aside. So anyway, it was a very different legal system in that sense. Trials generally did not go on and on forever. They were usually very quick and required, in most cases, at least 2, sometimes 3 or more witnesses. You could never convict somebody with a single witness. There was also, for corrupt officials, of which there seems to have been no shortage in this time, various government officials who decided to pocket the funds for themselves. The answer to that, if it was a bad enough crime, then they were probably also executed. But if it was just kind of a middling type thing, then they were banished. And they were sent to some faraway hole in the wall in the empire where they'd never be heard of again. So a different kind of legal system, but it seemed to work for the most part for about 600 or 700 years. And actually, when the Persians came in, they adopted almost all of it too. So almost 1,000 years that system existed. Well, let's go back to the exile, which we had talked about, occurred in 3 different waves in the year 589, 587, 597, 587, and then probably 5 years after that. So there are 3 different waves of emigration or of deportation. Probably the greatest deportation was in 586, which would have been about when the king and all of his royal family and all the leaders of the temple were deported. The exile probably did not affect areas outside of Jerusalem, and especially the area that we call Samaria and Galilee, because those were already under Babylonian rule at that point. And the same is true of the various Arabic kingdoms, Edom, Moab, and Ammon, on the east side of the Jordan River. There is also, interestingly enough, no mention in any of these documents about the Philistines. So it can only be assumed they were still around. It can only be assumed they must have made a separate peace with the Babylonians.
Hmm.
There is, oh, by the way, let me back up for one thing. Last week I talked about the total deportation and annihilation of the Northern Kingdom, and Pastor Monty raised a good question about, do we know that that was actually the case? And I've been thinking about that some more. And even though the official Assyrian policy was, if you reach that fourth stage of troublesomeness, it was annihilation of the people. But I suspect that that was the policy and probably not what happened. And so I'm thinking more and more that there was probably a remnant left in the Northern Kingdom, but they were probably poor people and illiterate and had very little leadership. So it's, but they may have formed the nucleus of what later became a very strong Jewish presence in that area.
Interesting.
So anyway, so the Jews get sent to Babylon, and it seems to be, for the most case, they went to Babylon, not to some remote parts of the empire. And they seem to have formed a fairly cohesive community, from what little we know. Probably settled in the city of Babylon and some of its southern suburbs. And also, there seems to be some legend, at least, that there was a settlement, and this is borne out by Psalm 137, talking about the waters of Babylon, so that the settlement may actually have been fairly close to the river at some point. Now, it's the nature of Babylonian society that it had been a melting pot for 1,000 years or more. And so the Jews seem to have blended in fairly well as another nationality among the 30 or 40 nationalities that were already in the city. Let me say a little bit here about the issue of race. We've noted that the idea of slavery had nothing to do with race. And the idea of race really has nothing to do with a biological entity or biological condition. It's strictly a linguistic affair. And we categorize people in the Middle East by their linguistic group, simply because it sort of makes sense to try to make some order out of the 50 or more languages that were in this area, if you can imagine. And so the major linguistic groups are the Semitic and the Indo-European languages. There's also a small number of languages that don't seem to fit in anywhere. Like you may know, in Ken and Donna would know this from being in Spain, there's an area called where they speak Basque. And Basque has no relation to any other language on this planet.
Wow.
Well, the same thing is true in the Mesopotamia, but you do, the Semitic languages are the predominant ones, and they just to list them, they are Akkadian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Babylonian, Arabic, Canaanite, Ethiopian, Phoenician, and then something called Western Semitic, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The Indo-Europeans, on the other hand, which are related to English and German and French and almost all the European languages, include Hittite, Persian, Median, which we now call Kurdish, Armenian, Greek, and Philistine. So those are non-Semitic languages. Then there are languages, like I said, that seem to have no relationship to anybody else. Sumerian is one of those. There have been attempts to link Sumerian to a couple other remote areas of that area of the world, but no success so far. Egyptian is idiosyncratic, just doesn't relate to anything. Harappian, which is the language of the Indus Valley, is likewise of that order, and so is Elamite, which is to this day, I think, is still spoken in parts of southern Iran. But it's And the ancient Elamite has never been translated, so we're not quite sure exactly what those people were up to, except making a lot of trouble. So anyway, I want to end the discussion of the exile on a very strange note. And Kevin noted this in his discussion. At the very end of Second Kings, we have a passage that I want to read. In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the year Awel Marduk became king of Babylon, he released Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison. He did this on the 27th day of the 12th month, Babylonian position again. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. Interesting thought there, too. So Jehoiakim put aside his prison clothes and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day, the king gave Jehoiakim a regular allowance as long as he lived. Like I said, this is kind of an odd little piece that gets tacked on to the end of after you have all this death and destruction and things being burned to the ground and people being called into exile. Then you have this kind of little happy note at the end of things. And most biblical scholars, I think, thought that this was probably just an attempt to try to make the best of things. And then, about 100 years ago or so, archaeologists found a tablet from the year 592, which confirms this biblical story. And so apparently, maybe things were not all that bad for the Jews in Babylon. We do know that this is kind of anecdotal evidence. There's not much hard copy here, but that the the Jewish society actually seemed to have developed pretty well in Babylon over the three generations that it was there.
It didn't get a reputation for being a sellout because he made friends with a Babylonian king.
Oh, I think, I think certainly Jehoiakim would have gotten that reputation. And I think a lot of Jews would have too. I think a lot of Jews rose to positions in prominence in business and in the arts and sciences. And they were probably looked upon by some of their fellow Jews as being sellouts.
Well, in the Book of Esther, there people in that book that have risen to some prominence or authority that are Jews in Babylon. In Esther, Esther.
I'm sorry, I missed that, Pastor.
Esther's uncle is a Jewish.
Oh yes, yeah.
Yes, right.
Yeah, and that probably reflects both the way things were in the Babylonian period and also in the Persian period. There is a tension between Jews who remained ritually pure and religiously pure and those who kind of sold out and became part of society. It's interesting to note, and we have this on considerable documentary evidence, that after the exile, a lot of Jews did not go back to Jerusalem. They stayed in Babylon. Now, these were people who had been born in Babylon. You have to remember, 70 years pretty well wipes out the older generation completely. And we do know that by the time of Jesus, and especially the period immediately after Jesus' ministry, that the second largest center of Jewish learning and education in the world was Babylon. Jerusalem was one, Babylon was number two, Alexandria was number three. So there is and that presence in Babylon, I don't know if there are still synagogues in Babylon, of course, the city is gone, but in the cities around there, I don't know if there are any synagogues still existing there, but there were up until the beginning of the 20th century. Anyway, let's talk about what happens during the exile in terms of Judaism as a religion. And I have suggested on this, this slide is still up there, I hope. Um, Outside of two very obvious negative responses to the exile, one of which would have been run off and hide in a cave somewhere, or go to Egypt or to Arabia, the other option being suicide, neither of which have very good outcomes. There are probably 5 different approaches that a Jew could have taken to the exile. And they're not, well, the first 2, I think, they're mutually exclusive. The last 3 are actually supportive of one another. So the first one would be simply to abandon Judaism, um, and accept the Mesopotamian religion. Now let me scroll down here to my notes. Sorry. So it was possible to simply adopt when in Rome, do as the Romans do, and when in Babylon, adopt the Babylonian religion. We don't know how many people did that. We have absolutely no statistics to go on here. But my guess is that that probably appealed to as much as a quarter of the people who simply, they were already used to blending in the Taoistic religion with all kinds of other idols and gods while they were living in Judah. And so they simply adapted to the Mesopotamian religions, which were a little bit different from the ones that they had, experienced in Canaan. So anyway, you have that either abandoning the religion altogether, and we probably never hear any more of about those people, or creating some kind of a syncretistic blend, some of which incidentally will be brought back after the exile. This is one of the problems we have with the return from the exile. The second option would be to abandon all religious belief and practice completely. I know that seems unlikely. That sort of smacks of what we call secularism, and secularism we think is a very modern idea. But it does seem that there had been a decline in all religion in Babylonia during this period, and probably in the Assyria before that. There are complaints by the temple authorities that their temples are run down, they're not getting the kind of support, and so forth. So there is a thought that there might have been kind of like a thin veneer of religion that was kind of wearing thin, even in Babylonia at this point. So it may have been possible to be completely secular and throw all religion aside. There are also, I should mention, though there are conflicting reports that indicate that temple building was going on at a tremendous rate during this period. So we don't really know. The military, which seems to have been attractive to some Jews, was another route, probably a kind of a near secularity. Even though you would, perform rites before a battle or something like that, if you were simply an occupying or a marching army, there was not a great deal of attention paid to religion. So anyway, you have that possibility of just throwing everything overboard. I would guess that's a very small number that did that. But nonetheless, between the first 2 options, you probably have about a third of the Jews abandoning Judaism in one form or another. Now, what about the other 2/3, though? What happened with them? Well, I'm suggesting there are at least 3 things you can do. And one of them is you kind of reinterpret the history of the Hebrew nation, and you try and make sense out of what happened. A second one would be what I call repristination of liturgical practice. And the third would be to revisit and reinterpret the whole idea of the covenant. So we're going to talk about those first, the interpretation of history and the repersonation of liturgical practice. We're going to talk about this today, I hope, if I don't run out of time. The final one on the covenant, saving that for an entire session next week. So, how do you reinvent your past? We actually do it a lot more than we think we do.
Yep.
Some histories of the United States written during the 1800s did a very good job of rewriting the past completely of American history. In the process, they wrote out all the Blacks and American Indians in the process, or made them into negative figures. We're constantly rewriting history in this country. In terms of the Hebrew history, we have a huge document, and we call it the Hebrew epic. And it consists of, in the Hebrew Bible, it consists of 4 books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. In the Christian version of the Bible, it's been expanded to 6 books because Samuel and Kings each get first and second sets. This epic covers over 600 years of Hebrew history, from the end of the 13th century up to the time of the exile. As Kevin has pointed out, there probably were several different authors involved. Even in the book of Second Kings, we see possibly different authors. So a lot of different authors in this project, a lot of different editors as well, putting things together. And the process probably, well, it was a long process, but it probably culminated between the year 640, which would be the start of Josiah's kingdom, so his royal rule, and the year 580, which is a few years after the second and total disastrous siege of Jerusalem. And the theme of this epic is that Judah, the people of Israel, remnant, has been destroyed because of their idolatry and their other transgressions, their failure to keep the covenant. And that is a theme which is hammered again and again and again throughout this entire epic. The epic itself, by the way, is made up of probably a number of books which have long been lost. It's made up of legends. It's made up of short stories, and maybe even a little mythic material, but not very much of that, interestingly enough. It's not history in the sense that we have history written by people like Herodotus and Thucydides and Xenophon. In the Greek tradition, it's a national epic, and epics tend to exaggerate, and they tend to make things bigger than they are, and sometimes more bloody than they are. The Hebrew epic, does not offer any really positive outlook, unless you look at that very last sentence I just referred to. But it does try to make sense out of what happened. And it says, events and actions have consequences. And if the way you lead your life is to disregard God, break the covenant, worship idols, don't do the acts of social justice that are required of you, you're going to be in for big trouble. And it happened. So that's basically the message of the Hebrew epic. Any questions or comments on that? I know it's a huge subject, and we had a whole unit on it a couple years ago.
Well,
okay.
So I'm wondering which of the books were kind of rewritten or reshaped in light of the exile. I guess all of them would be one answer. we were looking at First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, and Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, the whole Pentateuch, certainly
Well,
Deuteronomy. Yeah. So
I think everything gets rewritten to a certain extent. I think the epic, as it develops, is probably not revised all that much, except at the very end, where they have to account for the destruction of Jerusalem. And so, that part of it is probably very contemporaneous with what had just happened. But yeah, I think, well, Chronicles is a totally different kettle of fish. That's an interpretation that was written more than 100 years later. And I think we'll see when we look at Deuteronomy and also the other books of Moses, they've also gone through a number of changes in editing. There are a couple, well, I'll talk more about Deuteronomy later.
okay.
So yes, this is a constant. There's a constant change, even though we think of the Bible, the old fundamentalist approach is that God wrote it all down exactly right the first time, and that's certainly not the view of the Bible that we take today. So let me get a drink here. My little glass says, be a little more Lutheran, whatever that means. So I want to talk about the other side of this, which is the let's try that again. Repristination of the Jewish religion. Repristination is a hard word to say, but it is a fairly simple concept. Let's go back to the beginning and start over. And we see this in a number of American theological movements and the Protestant churches. We see it certainly in fundamentalist movement, and it's certainly true in a number of Islamic movements. The Wahhabist movement is a repristination. And in a sense, I suppose the Latter-day Saints are also. So it's a fairly common practice in any kind of religious tradition, whether you're talking Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, Islam, Judaism. At certain points, you have some leaders that say, this has just gotten too messy and too complicated. Let's go back to the beginning and start over. And in terms of Judaism at this time, I think this process had begun long before the exile. And the high point of it, there may have been something in Hezekiah's reign, but the high point of it is really what we call the Josianic Reformation, which is a period from about 640 to 608, 609. The key document that comes out of this movement of repristination is the Book of Deuteronomy. Now, the Book of Deuteronomy, very simply, takes the form of a collection of farewell speeches by Moses. This is Moses speaking to the people of Israel. Here is what you have been through. Here is what you are currently confronting. Here's where you've gone wrong in the past. Here is where you need to shape up. And here is what your future looks like. That's basically the story of Deuteronomy. Now, in many ways, it parallels things that are in other documents. And we could compare those. That's a whole other subject. But anyway, Deuteronomy is a document, I think, primarily of the 7th century, though certainly its roots would go back further than that. Structurally, it's a mess. It's repetitious, redundant in many places. It meanders all over the place. and then comes back to its previous point, and then meanders off again in a different direction. It includes several different sections, and as I said, one of them is Moses saying, this is your history as a people. And this is what you need to remember. This is where we came from. This is who we are. And this is how God created us. Not the earth, but how it created us as a people. It then includes a lot of blessings and curses. You will be blessed if you do this, but if you will be cursed if you do this instead. And so there's a whole collection of those. And then finally, there are some very concrete, very specific rules for ethical living, which grow out of those blessings and curses. So it's a very extensive formula, I guess you could say, for righteous living and for following ritual purity and ritual rules. Now, there's some questions about the book of Deuteronomy. First of all, there's a question. There is a book, according to Kings, there is a book that is found in the temple, sort of collecting dust off in some corner or some closet or something. And the book is discovered, it is brought to the king. The king realizes that this is the word of God. And so it launches the Reformation that basically uproots a lot of the traditional Israelite religion at that point. So is this a book or not?
I'd heard that they found the scroll in the wall as they were prepared, like
Right.
making some repairs. A workman leaned his hand against the wall and kind of fell through. And so that's what I'd heard.
Well, historians have looked at that and said there are three possibilities about this. One may be indeed that it was an old book from predating the 7th century, and it was found in the temple. Now, this leads me to believe that the temple must have been a pretty bad mess, that they didn't even know what their library looked like, but it's possible. It's certainly possible.
Like the Vatican Library, they keep finding things there too.
Well, there were times that the Vatican Library was a horrendous mess. And of course, at some time, I want to speak to the either the forum or Bible study, or probably the forum, about the Cairo Ganitza, which is a storeroom in a synagogue in Cairo, where they found 600 years of records that had just been thrown in there and left to gather dust. So, I mean, it's possible that this was an old book and was simply found during the process of renovation of the temple. The second possibility is that it may have been created right around this time or shortly before, and it just very conveniently said the things that needed to be said for Josiah's Reformation. The third possibility is that it was actually created by the people who were doing the Reformation. That's a kind of a cynical look. I don't know too many historians who subscribe to that anymore, but it's a possibility. I think more likely, if you want, I don't know if anybody wants my opinion on this, but I think that it was probably developed from several sources during the early part of the 7th century. You may remember there was a king by the name of Manasseh who gets the honor, if you want to call it, and the glory of being the worst king ever in the history of Judah. And I suspect that there may have been some underground movements among the religious leaders during that time. And it may very well be during that reign, which preceded, there was one intermediate king and then Josiah becomes the next king. It may have been that that document comes out of a time where the religious leadership is actually under persecution. Nonetheless, we have the book of Deuteronomy. And the only thing we can really say for sure about the book of Deuteronomy is it was not written by Moses. Now, historically, the 5 books of Moses were written by Moses, and fundamentalists will still believe this. You can find at least 100 websites that tell you this. There's a problem. The time of Moses, probably the time at the end of Moses' life, is right around the year 1200. Hebrew writing does not exist until 200 years later.
Hmm.
So if Moses wrote it, what did he write it in? What language? This
You don't
also,
have to convince me.
pardon?
I said you do not have to convince me.
Well,
This also raises,
I'll put out the opposite argument. and that is-
this also raises, pardon?
I was to say, I can put out an opposite argument, and that is that the Deuteronomy is repetitive. And that would indicate maybe oral transmission, because repetitive, I mean, if you look at old epics, Homer or whatever, Beowulf, whatever, they're repetitive. They got a lot of repetitive phrases and things that get used time and time again. Is that a possibility here?
Well, it's a possibility. And that would certainly argue for a greater age to Deuteronomy.
Mhm.
There are a couple of problems with it. Is that the style of Deuteronomy doesn't really match oral traditions.
Mhm.
And the other is that the language in which it's written is typical of the 7th century.
So that's
So
a real key point there, yeah.
I guess it's possible, the old oral traditions had been written down on scraps and somebody put them together in a modern version, just like we've done with the Bible to translate it. And it's an open question at this point. But it raises an interesting question also about the 10 Commandments. What language were they written in? If there is no Hebrew at that point, they can't have been written in Hebrew.
Mhm.
Because then you've got these stone tablets. Were they cuneiform tablets?
Not in Cecil B. DeMille's version.
I think they're written.
No, Cecil B. DeMille would have gone crazy if they'd been cuneiform tablets. They just don't have the same appeal and look to them. There is some thought that they may have been in a language called Proto-Sinaitic, which is actually much older than Hebrew. And interestingly enough, scraps of it, or actually fairly substantial scraps of it, have been found in Egypt from as far back as 150 to 200 years before the time of the Exodus. So who knows? Anyway, I know that's an aside, and that's sort of like putting pennies on the railroad track. It's not what we're really here to talk about. But it's always kind of I've always wondered what language was that written in? Now, I'm going to call up a different screen here. Okay. I want to talk about the effect of the exile upon the interior religious structure of Judaism. And this, again, is an extremely complicated and somewhat controversial, with most of the people doing the arguing various Jewish scholars. I know a number of Christian scholars as well. For instance, Walter Brueggemann, among others, have weighed in on various of these issues. But I want you to take a look at this list of what to me appear to be the kind of the major core beliefs and practices of Judaism at the time of the exile, before the exile occurs. And none of these are very unusual or strange. You have the covenant, you have the belief in one God, monotheism, you have worship in the temple, respect for the writings, the Torah, dietary laws, a number of codes of purity, the practice of circumcision, annual festivals, and the observance of the Sabbath. And most of these show up very prominently, by the way, in Deuteronomy. Now, some of these were not affected greatly by the exile. I find no evidence that the practice of circumcision changed at all. I think other than the fact that the festivals could no longer be observed in Jerusalem, there was very little change in their structure once they returned from the exile. Whether they had them in Babylon or not, nobody knows. At least we haven't found any documentation on it. The dietary laws seem to have not changed greatly. And the purity codes also don't seem to have been affected. These are all things that are rather personal habits, if you will, or personal religious practices. And so just moving a people from Jerusalem to Babylon probably didn't interfere with them very much.
But Richard, they also establish the group. That is, they separate the Jews from everybody else. Wouldn't that be true?
As a form of identity.
Right, yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, that is, and I think, I don't really deal with that too much in my notes here, but the reason why you have these core beliefs and practices in the homeland is to distinguish the Jews from non-Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these become very important once they get transported to Babylon. So I would say, for instance, that we don't really know anything about dress at this point. We have absolutely zip information on that. But I think in terms of things like the dietary laws and the codes of purity, those are probably things that would have distinguished the Jews from non-Jews in Babylon. And so they were probably not only continued, but they would have been intensified.
Yeah.
Now, some of the others, however, had to undergo some changes. And one of these is the Torah. Now, you notice in this list of core beliefs, I talked about respect for Torah, because Torah does not have quite the same, what should we say, religious awe, it appears, as it does after the exile. So you have to ask yourself, what was the Bible, say at the time of Josiah?
What was the Bible?
Yeah, what did the Bible consist of? Well, it was a bunch of scrolls, and it probably included what we now call parts of the J and the E traditions, which were probably more or less collections of fragments rather than an extended narrative. We had the books of Amos and Hosea and Isaiah and Nahum and Micah and probably Zephaniah. So you may have had like 6 prophets. You had Psalms. You had a short story, Ruth, and you had a very strange book, which was probably translated from Arabic into Hebrew at some point, called Job. And in addition to that, you had various collections of poetry and short stories. In other words, you did not have a unified document that said, this is the Bible, this is the Torah. It was a bunch of bits and pieces. Now, if you fast forward even 100 years to say 520 or 500, this is a completely changed picture. By then, you have the beginnings of what we know as the Bible. And during that period, that 100+ years, you have written the Hebrew epic, which I've just talked about, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. You have the Book of Deuteronomy. You have 3 of the major prophets, the second part of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. You have the Book of Lamentations that we quoted from last week. You have more Psalms. Psalms are being written all the time. And you have a kind of a unified not chronicle, this is the right word, a kind of a unified narrative from these earlier sources, the JE documents. So the Bible actually takes shape during the exile and in the years immediately following the exile, as well as bringing in documents that are just prior to the exile. It's a tremendous change. The Torah goes from being a bunch of miscellaneous scrolls in which probably different collections had different scrolls. You may remember that in the formation of the New Testament, each church had its own set of scrolls or books once they started going to the book form. And so some had this letter of Paul, others had this letter of Paul, others had these general epistles. Some had 2 gospels, some had 3, some had 5. There was no uniformity. Well, that is the status of the Hebrew scripture, the Old Testament, prior to the exile. So the exile is a time of tremendous intellectual and literary creativity, unequaled, I think, pardon me, in the history of the world.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
Wow. There's a certain urgency that comes in when you feel like things are going to fall apart. Um, and that could spur them to write things down or not take it for granted as maybe they had done. Um,
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. The impetus to writing down the Gospels, other than the Gospel of Mark, but the Matthew, Luke, and John were written down because the perception was that the generation that had known Jesus or had studied under people who had known Jesus was passing away. We were
yeah.
losing the contact with the past, and it is now time to collect this information and have it in a permanent state. And I think it's the same thing's happening here, saying, we have lost everything. Uh, if we don't recover this past, if we don't put this into kind of some solid form, we may simply be wiped out of history.
Well, there and in Mark, there's seems to be an additional idea that what was being lost in the early Christian community was the cross. The
Mm-hmm.
idea that there was some pain here, and not just the glory of being in the body of Christ, in kind of the story of incarnation that makes us gives us a sense of unity with God.
Yeah.
And the conundrum of the cross was was forgotten or in jeopardy of being forgotten.
Yeah, the reason I did not mention Mark in that story is because I think there it is written not well necessarily all the apostles are still alive, but certainly the people who had studied under them. So the second generation was still alive. But by the time the other gospels are written, we're into the third generation.
Yeah.
And it becomes a desperate measure to collect documents and to put the story together. Well, again, I think exactly the same thing is going on here in terms of the creation of the Hebrew scriptures. Now, I want to just close up with one thing talking about worship actually, well, I'll try and do this real briefly. I may have to come back to it a little bit next time. But the worship prior to the exile was centered in the temple. There seems to be no question about this, other than for the pagan rites that were taking place all over the place. And there is also the issue of Bethel, but I've never quite figured out how that all fits in. But Jerusalem was the center of everything. So what happens if the center of your entire worship, liturgical, ritual, cultic life vanishes? How do you recreate that in Babylon? And there are questions that have been raised with absolutely no evidence that they may have built the second temple in Babylon. It doesn't seem likely. I would think it seems very unlikely. We do know that the Egyptian Jews did create their own temple, but there's no evidence of that in Babylon. Now, the sacrificial worship, the sacrificing of grain and of animals, that was also part of that temple worship. So what happens? Can you do that in Babylon? And again, we don't really know what happened.
Well, I don't want to take away the mystery, but I mean, isn't what emerges is the Pharisaic kind of the rabbis reading of scripture?
Yes. Yeah, and I think I've got about a 15-minute section here, so I think maybe I will save that for next time, because I want to talk about what happens in worship in place of the temple, and there's also a conflict between different orders of priesthood. But you have the evolution of a couple institutions, namely the synagogue.
Yeah.
Whether it's called that at this time or not, we're not quite sure. But you also have the institutionalization. You can tell I'm running out of words here. Of the rabbi, but also the scribe, two very important figures in the religious life of the Jews of Jesus' period. Both of which are, in a certain sense, opposed to the priesthood. And that gets into a kind of an interesting little mess here. You also have some changes in the treatment of the Sabbath, and also want to talk about a little bit on the development of sectarianism within Judaism. So there's a whole bunch of stuff we haven't got to today. But if you'll permit me, I think I'll end right there and carry on next week.
Well, thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
We're zipping through a whole lot of history here, but it's very important, to have some understanding of this history. I think when we're reading these books of the Bible, it makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think it's important when we read the books of the Hebrew Scripture, but it also is very important when we read the story of Jesus and the Christian community, because they are in so many ways impacted by the changes that take place. And I'll talk, for instance, next time I'll talk about the development of the idea of the Messiah.
Yeah.
But
It's part of the backdrop of the Jesus story, and you get the contrast between what Jesus is saying in his Gospels when you compare it to what had gone before. There's continuity, but also some striking differences.
Yeah.
And that's more apparent when you have a sense of that history. Yeah.
Okay, so we will continue next week, God willing.
All right.
Sounds good.
Peace
Thank
be
you.
upon you. Sleep well. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Take care.
Bye.
Later. Bye-bye.